Tier lists and class rankings, are they good for the community? In this video, we take a look at how one of the most popular tier lists are made and ask an expert, can we do better? Welcome to the latest episode of the PaleCast, which starts right now. Thousands, if not millions, of World of Warcraft players are familiar with Subcreation, a website dedicated to taking gameplay data, analyzing it, and declaring what are the best and worst classes and dungeons in WoW every week, and then putting it all in an easy-to-read, approachable graphic or two. Now, for both good or bad, Subcreation's influence on the WoW community and perceptions of classes and content is undeniable. On one hand, it's a fantastic tool that can help players when choosing a class or deciding what they want to do with their afternoon with their friends, right? Is a certain dungeon F tier this week, meaning it's really hard? Well, if that's your key, maybe you skip it and instead you do a friend's key. On the other hand, since Subcreation evaluates classes, that leads to consequences for players, the actual humans behind the characters worldwide. If your class is considered S tier, which means the best of the best, you're going to get invited to groups much more easily. But if you play a class that's considered C, D, or F tier, you might find yourself a pariah with not a lot of options. Now that brings us to my guest for today's episode of the PaleCast, DeadlyDog, a software developer and WoW player from Denmark with a background in math, computer science, and logic. He's also the creator of ZugZugCreation, a project also aimed at collecting data from Raider.io and analyzing it. And he's published some, I think it would be fair to say, concerns about Subcreation's calculations and the effect they might be having on the community. So, DeadlyDog, I appreciate you joining me today. I know I'm here on the East Coast of the US and you're several hours into the future, so I know it's about bedtime for you and it's not quite quitting time at work for me, and I appreciate your time today as we try to get this interview done. Thanks for joining.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So TLDR, how much do you agree or disagree with where Subcreation has gone about evaluating the data and putting classes into a tier system?
They've done really great work. It's a lot of work to get to the point where they are currently, and all I did was essentially to start off from where they kind of left the ball, so to speak, and then I just ran with it a little bit further, right?
Are the classes as far apart as a strict tier system that can appear on a website like Subcreation or, candidly on just about any YouTuber's channel, right? Are the classes really as far apart as those tier systems make them seem to be in your mind?
Yeah, so what my analysis kind of says is that that there's a contribution from each kind of specialization in what their kind of strength is, but the kind of TLDR version is that there's a much larger contribution from player skill. So the skill of the player has a much larger effect on, the score of a given dungeon run compared to the specs themselves. And as a ballpark figure, the player skill is about 4 to 5 times higher than the specialization strength. The other important thing is that there's also a very large contribution from dungeons in Season 1. Turns out that the dungeons have a vast difficulty difference. And that turns out that if you run your Court of Stars or you run your Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, it's about 1.7 key levels easier than your Alcaras Academy, for instance. And that has a very large effect as well. But what you end up, when you kind of analyze the data, you come to the conclusion that the dungeon has a large effect, the player skill has a large effect, but the specializations themselves are not that large of an effect. It's on the smaller side.
I read your website and you said before I could do my analysis, I wanted to kind of retrace Subcreation steps. Are there some opportunities they have in the way they break down their data and report it to the community? Are there some opportunities for them to do that in a way that might be a little more transparent for the community or improve the community in your opinion?
Yeah, sure. So when I started by retracing the steps of Subcreation, you whenever you kind of dig into stuff like this, you're gonna find like rough edges.
For DeadlyDog, those rough edges amounted to 4 opportunities to potentially improve Subcreation's methods and better inform the community about relative class and dungeon strength. First, by factoring in player skill, as you just heard him mention, before even looking at the classes they play.
The trick is actually not to measure specialization strength right away, but rather model player skill. And from that, you can kind of figure out what the spec strengths are, right? So it's kind of like an indirect way where you are figuring out the specialization contribution. The smart thing about that is that now you're not looking at like one player and their skill. You're looking at all players playing the spec and their skill. So you can look at shifts. You can look at, for instance, that a certain spec, every player playing that spec is playing at a little bit higher level than everybody else, right? So it doesn't matter what skill bracket you're looking at, everybody is kind of shifted upwards a little bit. And you would argue that if that happens, it might be a contribution not by the players, but by the specialization.
Second, you have to account for the same players filling up the Raider.io leaderboards that Subcreation uses to populate their tiers, and how that can skew the data in favor of certain classes.
You have these players, you have a player, and some of the really good players, they are extremely active. They play something like 20 to 30 dungeon runs a week, which is pretty scary, I think. But
I did that last week to push at the end of the season, and would not recommend.
Right, and remember, they tend to do this every week, right? That's part of why they are so good, right? So then the question becomes, if you have a player that plays something like maybe Protection Paladin, right? And they are playing like 19 dungeon runs this week. That is one player playing 19 runs, right? But if you're not careful, you end up measuring like 19 runs played by one player. So you're kind of turning it around, so you're not looking at this as you're looking at each run as an independent thing, right? When in reality it's the same player that played them all.
It's like, and we see that example when we look at the Raider.io leaderboards, right? And you're trying to look at it, getting an idea, and you may see the same I play a tank, for example, so you might see the same 2 or 3 tanks, for several pages down the Raider.io leaderboard, because it's the same couple of guys populating all the data.
Right. And once you have that, you kind of realize that maybe you shouldn't measure this as independent runs, right? You might want to kind of keep the player the same player and say they have one contribution to the spec strength rather than having 20. And this is called it's called repeated measures or pseudo replication in statistics, where you end up by accident kind of taking the same person and doing multiple measurements on the same person, right?
Right.
And you're not factoring in that these are interlinked, right?
So if you've got a really high skill, incredibly talented prop paladin, let's keep going with your example there, and they are running a ton of keys and having a ton of success, the number of samples for a prop paladin is going to bring the average up, and it's going to bring all the other statistics, skew them a little more towards, prop paladin's better, for example, in your mind. What
will happen there is that they are able to, the most active players are able to kind of skew the numbers by being active. Right, and if they also happen to be on the better end of the kind of like, if they are in the better end, they'll definitely push up the spec, especially because Subcreation really only looks at the top 100 kind of spec runs. So if you imagine like having a handful, like 5 players that on Protection Paladin that are really active, well, those are the 5 players we are going to measure.
Another potentially complicating factor, all regions of players aren't equal in terms of player skill, gaming habits, and class preferences. But Subcreation pulls an equal amount of data from each region, which can shade the data in uneven ways.
Are there differences among the regions? There are 4 regions in World of Warcraft, and is there some kind of difference? Are some regions kind of like playing at a higher level than others? And surprised they are. Turns out that Europe is playing at a higher level than, for instance, Asia. And I don't think that is necessarily a skill thing. It's just that there are far more players playing in Europe. So if you go to the group finder, there's going to be a plethora of keys you can try to run, right? There's going to be more keys because there are more players. And that has a feedback loop, because then those players are able to play more keys, so they get more experience. That pushes up like the general kind of community as a whole, right? So they can run higher keys.
Sure.
And once they can run higher keys, well, then they will look better on the kind of like key level, so they can run compared to a more kind of like less populous region.
I got to be the ugly American here. Huh? Where did the North American region players stand along with everybody else? Tell us we weren't at the bottom.
No, you're square number 2 in the kind of thing, if you look at it.
We're number 2.
It's you have Europe as kind of like the strongest region, and then you have US kind of like overlapping quite a lot with Europe, right? But a little bit lower. And then you have the 2 Asian regions in Taiwan and South Korea. Once you kind of look at that, you get to the conclusion that maybe because Subcreation is kind of pulling from all regions as what is called a stratified sampling. So they're pulling an equal amount of dungeon runs from each region. And then you have to make the question, if you want to kind of show the best dungeon runs, and you're pulling from each region, including some regions that are on the weaker side, then is that the right thing to do? Maybe you should just pull more dungeon runs from the regions that are stronger, right? And it all depends on what you want to show, right? If you want to kind of factor in all regions, well, then it's fair to pull from all regions. On the other hand, if you want the kind of strongest runs for a given week, maybe you should have pulled from the top.
Finally, DeadlyDog sees an opportunity in the actual way sites like Subcreation or Wowhead, and even your favorite streamer or YouTuber, displays the class evaluations in strict tier systems. And on his project website, he takes the criticisms we've summarized here in this video, addresses those concerns with some statistical fixes, and then, thankfully, if you're a visual person like me, has pictures and graphs that show what he believes to be a more nuanced and accurate representation of how class and specialization strength stacked up in Season 1 dungeons. I think you've done a fantastic job putting together some visualizations, and I'd like to get to that. If you wouldn't mind, walk me through what we're seeing here in this graphic.
It's very deliberate that I wanted WoW players to understand what is going on. Because I think that an important part of statistics is that you need to be able to communicate it to people. But what you're seeing there is that we have a model going on, in a statistical model that is trying to separate kind of like specialization strength out of the data that we pulled from the leaderboards. So what we're looking at is that, imagine that you have all the players, right? And all the players, we have an expectation about what kind of skill levels those players will have. That most of the players, they don't even break 500 Mythic Plus score. If you pull a player at random, there's a much greater chance that you will pull a player at about, say, 450 score than pulling one at like 3,200 score, which is up in the other end of the thing, right? What I'm doing is I'm doing these kind of curves for every specialization and try to figure out, given a specialization, and drawing players randomly for the specialization, where are they supposed to lie on this thing, right? Then what you can do is you can start to look at, are there certain specs where there are fewer players at the low skill levels and more players at the higher skill level, right? So now we have it for each healer, the same thing, but for each healer split out. So what happens is that you get these curves, and the curves have a coefficient that says how flat they are, basically.
Right.
So these are the kind of, that is a coefficient that kind of tells you each of these kind of like discipline priest, holy paladin, holy priest, etc. That is a measure of how flat the curve is. The more to the right you are, the higher a coefficient, the flatter the curve. Which means that you have fewer players playing at the low levels and more players playing at the higher skill brackets. And if that happens across the board, that would indicate that it is one of the stronger specs.
DeadlyDog walked me through this example of visually representing relative healer strength from Season 1. These are the money shots you came to watch this video for, so let's go ahead and take a moment and look at the data through all 3 dungeon roles. Now, one of the things I notice here, though, Deadly, is that it's this chart. We're not talking about, like, for example, with a site like Subcreation or any other YouTubers out there that are creating tier lists that go S to F. Your x-axis is not going from 0 to 7.2. It is going from 6.8 to 7.2, which, again, even to a layman now, I can, as someone who's not into statistics like you are, I can look at this and say, that must mean that we are much closer, class balance is much closer than a straight S to F tier system would seem to indicate.
The problem with the tier lists is that if you look at these, you can see that these kind of like distributions that are over the points, right? There's this curve over the points, and that is because the way we are computing it, there's an uncertainty. So we are not really computing one point, we are computing a distribution, and says basically that this spec falls inside this distribution, and where it's highest is the most likely. So that is what is marked with a little kind of like colored dot. So the takeaway here is that there's a lot of overlap, right? That a lot of these curves are overlapping. And when the curves are overlapping to a large extent, it becomes hard to say with certainty that this is a stronger spec than that one, right? The more of an overlap there is, the weaker that argument becomes. So if you were to kind of tier list this, you might want to say something like Restoration Druid might be kind of like the strongest, maybe. And then
when played the best, though, right? Because even by your distribution model here, if I'm an average Resto Druid player and you, Deadly, you are an exceptional world-class Preservation Evoker player, you are most certainly playing at least the same level I am in terms of output and success, possibly even eclipsing me. Would that be a fair assumption? A fair interpretation?
And you might even have that one player like 10 key levels above the other, right? What this is showing is that if you compare yourself to a player that has kind of like the same skill level as you, right? So say you're playing Preservation Evoker and you're comparing yourself to a Restoration Druid that is kind of like at the same skill level, then this would indicate that they might be able to run a key level higher or two. Right?
However the math is handled under the hood, is a tier system, the S through F tier system, is that the best way to display the data for the community? Or do we need to be seeing distribution charts and other things like that? What do you think is the best way to display this kind of stuff for the community in a way that they can absorb it and digest it, but also get a more complete story?
Yeah, so the thing you have to look out for when you're looking at these tier lists are that you can only be in one tier, right? A spec can only be in one tier. Once they have done that, what they have really done is they've made a ranking, right? They have just ranked the specs from the top spec to the lowest spec. And it's not necessarily, there's no kind of how much better is, what's the distance between two specs in A tier, right? That becomes a little bit kind of like murky, what that really is.
Or I would argue that even what's the difference, it's difficult to visualize the difference between the last spec in the A tier and the top spec in the B tier, right? But, unfortunately, it's just, I think, our human nature sometimes that, we like top 10 lists and we like easily digestible tier lists. It's good for, it's clickbaity. It's something that ESPN uses in all their sports shows, debate shows and stuff like that. So it gets clicks and it gets engagement. So what do we take away from this analysis? Is Subcreation wrong, air quotes? Are tier lists harmful for the community? Well, turns out, just like everything else that's worthwhile, the answer is rarely simple. And it really depends on what your goals are as a player and understanding if the data and the way it's displayed aligns with your skill level and your player goals. So is this, these kinds of techniques that you're talking about here, is this what a site like Subcreation needs to do, kind of open up their analysis to a greater sample size of the community and not just look at those top players, but look at a broader range?
So one problem with doing this is that now you're looking at the whole player base, right? And while that is kind of like fair if you are your average player, casual player like I am, right? Then that might actually be what you want. But if you happen to be a top player, that might not be what you want, right? In that case, you would either have to look at top players, which I do the same kind of data analysis just for the top players, or you would go the way that Subcreation does, where they are looking at dungeon runs and they are looking at top dungeon runs, right? So it depends on what you want out of the data, right? If you want these kind of like what's the best players playing, then looking at dungeon runs is actually not a bad idea at all. It's a brilliant idea.
Now, it's important to point out that this is not some kind of hit piece on Subcreation, Wowhead, or really any other content creators out there that do tier lists. Throughout the interview, DeadlyDog was incredibly complimentary of all the work that the folks at Subcreation have done, and he recognized their contribution to the WoW community. Turns out he's even actually working with them.
So I've been talking with the Subcreation developers, and we are kind of agreeing, so it's nice. Hopefully we can get some of these things done and get some of these ideas that I have about how to kind of like untangle the data set a little bit and maybe do it in a better way. Well, maybe that will flow into Subcreation someday.
And Alcaras over at Subcreation was nice enough to provide us with a statement for this video. Let's check it out. Always appreciate feedback. Subcreation is open source. And from folks like DeadlyDog, who went above and beyond with his in-depth analysis. We're excited to collaborate with him in the future to improve Subcreation's statistical analysis and agree with him that all models are wrong, some models are useful. Representing what's good is a tough problem since social dynamics come into play and what's popular, correlated, but is not the same as what's good. So once again, the website is ZugZugCreation.fly.dev. The link is in the description of this video. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive as we learned more about how the tools we use as players are actually developed and evaluated. My biggest takeaway here is what DeadlyDog said right up front. Player skill matters a whole lot more than what class you play. So my advice to you is to find good players that you enjoy playing with, and don't forget, have fun while doing it. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. It helps me out a lot. Don't forget, you can come hang out with me on Twitch most nights where I'm streaming Season 2 keys. Thank you so much for watching this video. A big thanks to DeadlyDog, Alcaras over at Subcreation, and of course, to you, the viewer, for hanging out with us. Until the next video, peace.